A racist officer took away a black girl's insulin without even realizing who her father would turn out to be. How did one decision lead to serious consequences and change the fates of everyone involved? Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and write in the comments where you're watching this from. Stephen Carter sat in the dim light of his kitchen, staring at the untouched coffee cup in front of him. The morning silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. The walls around him were bare, save for a few pictures of a younger, happier version of himself, flanked by a woman with a warm smile and a small girl with curly hair. Those days felt like another life, far removed from the man he had become. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, then glanced at the clock. It was 6:15 a.m., and the day was already pressing on him. Carter reached for his badge, which lay on the table next to his sidearm. The cool metal felt heavier than usual as he pinned it to his uniform. This was his ritual every morning, though lately it felt less like a duty and more like a burden. He turned on the small radio by the counter. A news anchor's voice filled the room, discussing the latest push for police reform in the city. Governor Harper continues his call for accountability and racial equality within law enforcement, promising sweeping changes to the department. Carter snapped the radio off mid-sentence, muttering under his breath. He wasn't in the mood to hear about Harper or his changes. From Carter's perspective, the governor was just another politician trying to score points at the expense of hard-working officers. What did Harper know about walking the beat, about facing danger every day? The drive to the precinct was uneventful, the city streets just beginning to stir with early morning commuters. As Carter navigated the familiar route, his thoughts turned inward. He had spent over 15 years in the force, patrolling the same neighborhoods, seeing the same faces. He knew these streets better than anyone, and he knew trouble when he saw it. Or at least he believed he did. By the time Carter arrived at the precinct, the hum of activity had already begun. Officers bustled about, sipping coffee and trading jokes as they prepared for their shifts. Carter nodded at a few familiar faces, but kept mostly to himself. The camaraderie of the department felt more like a distant memory these days. "Mornin', Carter," his partner Joe Ramirez called out as Carter approached his desk. Joe was a few years younger, but had a sharp wit that often cut through the monotony of their shifts. "You ready to save the city again?" Carter grunted in response, setting down his things. "Let's just get through the day." Joe smirked. "What's eating you this time? Don't tell me you're still stewing over Harper's speech." Carter shot him a look but said nothing. Joe chuckled. "Man, you need to relax. Harper's just another suit. Let him talk all he wants. It's not like he's the one out here dealing with the real world." Carter appreciated Joe's attempt to lighten the mood, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the world was changing in ways he didn't understand, and that he was being left behind. Their patrol assignment for the day took them to the east side of the city, a district known for its high crime rate and struggling communities. Carter had spent years in these neighborhoods and had developed a sharp eye for trouble. To him, the signs were always obvious: shifty glances, hurried movements, the unmistakable air of desperation. It was a skill that had served him well, or so he thought. The streets were quiet as their cruiser rolled through the neighborhood. The buildings here were old and crumbling, their facades marked with graffiti. Trash lined the curbs, and broken streetlights cast long shadows in the early morning light. Carter's gaze swept the scene, his hand instinctively resting on the grip of his sidearm. Joe broke the silence. You know, sometimes I wonder why anyone still lives in these parts. Feels like a dead end. Not everyone has a choice, Carter replied, his tone flat. Some people are stuck. Joe nodded but didn't press further. He knew better than to dig too deep when Carter was in one of his moods. Their patrol was interrupted by a call over the radio. All units, we've got a report of suspicious activity near Lincoln and 3rd. Possible loitering, juvenile involved. Proceed with caution. Carter exchanged a glance with Joe. Juvenile, huh? Probably just some kid skipping school. Or worse, Joe said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. Let's check it out. They arrived at the location within minutes, pulling up to a narrow alley tucked between 2 rundown apartment buildings. The air was heavy with the smell of garbage and mildew. As they stepped out of the cruiser, Carter's eyes immediately locked onto a figure near the back of the alley. A young girl, hunched over and rummaging through a backpack. She was small and thin, her oversized jacket hanging loosely on her frame. Her hair was a mess of dark curls, and her movements were frantic, almost panicked. Carter's instincts kicked in. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. "Hey," he called out, his voice sharp, "what are you doing back here?" The girl froze, her head snapping up. Her wide, fearful eyes met Carter's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she clutched the backpack tighter and took a step back. "Stop right there," Carter commanded, his hand moving to his belt. "Show me your hands." Girl hesitated, then slowly raised her hands, revealing a small plastic bag and a syringe. Carter's stomach tightened. He had seen this too many times before. "Drop the bag," he ordered. "It's not what you think," the girl said, her voice trembling. "It's my insulin. I need it. Please, I'm not lying." Carter's gaze flicked to the syringe, then back to her face. Her desperation was palpable, but years of experience had taught him to be cautious. He had heard every excuse in the book, every sob story designed to manipulate his sympathy. "Put the bag down," he repeated, his voice firm. "We'll sort this out." "No, you don't understand," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I need it now. Please, I'm sick." Carter hesitated, his grip on his belt tightening. Joe, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "Sarge, maybe." "Stay back," Carter snapped, cutting him off. His eyes remained locked on the girl. The tension in the alley was suffocating. The girl's breathing grew labored, her small frame shaking with the effort. Carter's mind raced. Was she telling the truth? Or was this another ploy? He couldn't afford to take chances, not here, not now. Finally, he took a step forward and reached for the bag. The girl let out a choked sob as she staggered back, her knees buckling beneath her. Before anyone could react, she collapsed onto the ground, her body convulsing. "Shit," Joe cursed, rushing to her side. "She's seizing." Carter stood frozen, his mind reeling. The plastic bag and syringe lay forgotten at his feet. For the first time in years, he felt the cold grip of doubt. What had he done? The sound of sirens in the distance snapped him back to reality. Paramedics arrived moments later, their urgent voices filling the air as they worked to stabilize the girl. Carter watched in silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a stone. As the ambulance pulled away, Joe turned to him, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "What the hell were you thinking?" Carter didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was stand there, staring at the empty alley, as the first cracks began to form in the foundation of his convictions. The aftermath of the incident in the alley lingered in Stephen Carter's mind like a weight he couldn't shake. The image of the girl collapsing, her body convulsing on the dirty ground, replayed in vivid detail. He barely slept that night, his thoughts circling back to her desperate cries, the syringe, and the heavy judgment in Joe's voice. "What the hell were you thinking?" Morning came too soon, and with it, a summons to the precinct. Carter knew what it meant. Questions, reports, accountability. The department didn't take kindly to incidents that drew public scrutiny, and this one had the makings of a firestorm. News of the confrontation had already spread, sparking whispers among his colleagues. When Carter arrived, the usual chatter in the precinct seemed quieter, more subdued. Eyes followed him as he walked to his desk, their curiosity thinly veiled behind forced smiles or polite nods. He sat down heavily, his fingers drumming against the wooden surface, but before he could collect his thoughts, a voice called his name. "Carter, Captain wants you in his office." The speaker was Officer Hill, a rookie who barely concealed the smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Carter ignored him and stood, adjusting his belt before heading to the captain's office. The walk down the corridor felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights overhead casting an unforgiving glare. Inside the office, Captain Willis sat behind his desk, his expression a mixture of weariness and restrained anger. The gray-haired man motioned for Carter to sit, then leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against a stack of papers. "Do you know how this looks, Carter?" Willis began without preamble. "A little girl, hospitalized after an encounter with one of our officers. And not just any officer, you." Carter kept his expression neutral, though his stomach churned. "I was following protocol, sir. The situation, Willis interrupted, his voice sharp, "is that you confiscated her insulin, a goddamn life-saving medication. Do you have any idea how that's going to play out in the media?" Carter opened his mouth to respond, but found himself hesitating. The truth was, he didn't know. He hadn't thought beyond the moment, beyond the need to assert control and maintain order. He had believed he was doing his job, but now the lines felt blurred. "She was acting suspicious," he said finally. "I couldn't take the risk." Willis sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Suspicious. That's your justification? Carter, this isn't the first time you've let your gut override your judgment. But this time, your gut landed a kid in the hospital." Carter bristled at the criticism but said nothing. He could feel the weight of Willis's disappointment pressing down on him, a reminder of the standards he was expected to uphold. "We're launching an internal review," Willis continued. "In the meantime, you're on desk duty, effective immediately." Desk duty. The words hit Carter like a slap. It was a punishment, plain and simple, a signal to everyone in the department that he had crossed a line. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the look in Willis's eyes stopped him. There was no room for negotiation. "Understood," Carter said, his voice tight. Willis nodded curtly, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "Don't make this worse, Carter. Keep your head down and let us handle the fallout." As Carter left the office, he felt the weight of every gaze in the precinct. The news had spread faster than he expected. Joe was waiting near their shared desk, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "How'd it go?" Joe asked, though the answer was obvious. "Desk duty," Carter muttered, dropping into his chair. He didn't look at Joe, focusing instead on the stack of paperwork in front of him. Joe hesitated, then leaned closer. "Look, man, I know you were trying to do your job, but maybe you should have listened to her. She wasn't a threat." The words stung more than Carter cared to admit. He wanted to lash out, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew Joe was right. Instead, he settled for silence, letting the weight of his partner's judgment hang between them. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Kayla Harper lay in a sterile white bed, her small frame dwarfed by the surrounding machinery. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors provided a steady backdrop to the tension in the room. Her father, Governor James Harper, sat by her side, his expression a mask of controlled fury. Kayla's eyes fluttered open, and she looked around disoriented. When her gaze met her father's, she tried to sit up, but he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Easy, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe now." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, the police?" Harper's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "Don't worry about that right now. Just focus on getting better." "But they didn't believe me," she continued, her words trembling. "I told them it was insulin, but he thought I was lying." Harper's smile faltered. He wanted to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, but this incident had stripped away any illusions she might have had about fairness or justice. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I promise you, Kayla, we're going to make this right," he said. "No one should ever go through what you did." His words were firm, but his mind was racing. The incident had already attracted media attention, and as governor, he knew he couldn't ignore it. But this wasn't just about politics. It was personal. The image of his daughter, vulnerable and frightened, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Back at the precinct, Carter's day dragged on in agonizing monotony. The desk duty assignment felt like a prison sentence, each passing hour reminding him of the career he had worked so hard to build. He sifted through paperwork, his mind constantly drifting back to the girl in the alley. What if she had been telling the truth all along? What if he had let his biases cloud his judgment? The questions gnawed at him, eroding the certainty he had always relied on. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Carter finally left the precinct, his steps heavy with exhaustion. The drive home was silent, the city's lights blurring into a haze of color. When he arrived, he collapsed onto his couch, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in his mind. The next morning brought no relief. The headlines were brutal. Police officer confiscates insulin from black teen, leaving her hospitalized. Carter's name was plastered across every article. His face shone alongside a photo of Kayla in her hospital bed. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Activists called for his resignation, accusing him of racial profiling and abuse of power. The department issued a vague statement promising an investigation, but it did little to quell the outrage. Carter avoided the news as much as possible, but the whispers followed him everywhere. In the precinct, on the streets, even in the grocery store, he felt the weight of judgment in every glance. For the first time in his career, Stephen Carter began to question everything he thought he knew, about himself, about his job, and about the world he had sworn to protect. The precinct had become a minefield. Stephen Carter navigated it cautiously, head low, avoiding the gazes of his colleagues. The whispers were no longer whispers. The news coverage of Kayla Harper's hospitalization had turned his once quiet life into a storm, and he could feel the judgment seeping into every corner of his world. The weight of their stares, their sidelong glances, bore into him like needles. At first, Carter tried to ignore it. He buried himself in paperwork, hoping to drown out the noise with the monotony of desk duty. But it was impossible to escape. Every news broadcast, every social media post seemed to sharpen the edges of his guilt. He didn't need Joe or anyone else to remind him of his mistakes. The girl's face, her terrified eyes, haunted him constantly. The department wasn't immune to the pressure. Reporters had camped outside the building, their cameras and microphones thrust forward at every officer who stepped outside. Protesters gathered on the steps, chanting slogans demanding justice for Kayla. Signs with phrases like "End racial profiling" and "Justice for all" bobbed in the crowd, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray stone of the precinct. Inside, the tension was palpable. Officers avoided discussing the case openly, but the atmosphere had shifted. Carter wasn't the only one under scrutiny. The entire department felt the weight of the public's anger. Conversations were hushed, punctuated by furtive glances toward the captain's office. Joe tried to offer some semblance of support, though even he seemed uncertain how to approach the situation. One afternoon, as they sat at their desks, Joe leaned over and said quietly, "Look, man, I know things are rough right now, but you've got to hold on. This'll blow over." Carter didn't respond. He knew Joe meant well, but the words rang hollow. This wasn't something that would blow over. The damage was done, and it felt irreversible. The breaking point came a few days later. Carter was working late, the precinct mostly empty, when Captain Willis called him into his office. The older man's face was grim, his usual stern demeanor weighed down by exhaustion. "Close the door, Carter," Willis said, motioning to the chair in front of his desk. Carter obeyed, sinking into the chair with a heavy sigh. Willis didn't waste time. "The governor has called for an independent review of the department. They're bringing in outside investigators to look into claims of racial bias and misconduct." Carter's stomach sank. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed was another blow. "And what does that mean for me?" he asked, his voice low. Willis hesitated, then leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "It means you're going to be their first target. The media has already painted you as the face of the problem. They're going to dig into your record, your cases, everything." Carter felt a surge of anger. "I followed protocol," he said, his voice rising. "I did my job. And now I'm being thrown to the wolves?" Willis raised a hand to silence him. "I don't like this any more than you do, Carter. But this isn't just about you. The department is under fire, and they need a scapegoat." The word hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Scapegoat. Carter clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but he knew it was useless. The system he had spent his life defending was now turning against him. "Take some time off," Willis said finally. "Lay low, let this play out." Carter stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Time off won't fix this," he said, his voice cold. Without waiting for a response, he left the office, slamming the door behind him. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Kayla Harper was grappling with her own struggles. Though her condition had stabilized, the incident had left scars deeper than the physical. She had always been a quiet, thoughtful child, but now her silence was weighted with something heavier: fear. The hospital room felt like a prison. The white walls, the constant beeping of machines, the sterile smell. It was suffocating. She longed to be outside, to return to her normal life, but she knew that life was gone. The world outside wasn't safe anymore, not after what had happened. Her father, Governor James Harper, visited her every day, his presence a mix of comfort and tension. She could see the strain in his eyes, the way he tried to hide his anger when he spoke to the doctors or answered calls on his phone. He was fighting for her. She knew that. But she also knew that his fight was bigger than her. It was about the world they lived in, the world that had turned its back on people like them. One afternoon, Kayla finally broke her silence. "Why did he hate me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harper, caught off guard, turned to her with a pained expression. "Who, sweetheart?" "The police officer," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "Why did he think I was lying? I didn't do anything wrong." Harper struggled to find the right words. How could he explain the complexities of prejudice to a 12-year-old? How could he tell her that the world was unfair, that people would judge her not for who she was, but for what she looked like? "It's not about you," he said finally, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "Some people, they see what they want to see. They don't look deeper, and that's wrong. But it's not your fault." Kayla nodded, though she didn't fully understand. The pain in her chest was still there, a dull ache that refused to fade. Back at the precinct, Carter's situation continued to deteriorate. The independent review was brutal. Investigators combed through his record, questioning his past arrests and decisions, every action he had taken. Every judgment call was dissected and scrutinized. Colleagues who once trusted him now kept their distance, wary of being associated with him. Even Joe, his closest ally, seemed unsure how to bridge the growing gap between them. The isolation was crushing. The protesters outside grew louder, their chants echoing through the precinct walls. Carter avoided looking at them, but their voices were impossible to ignore. Justice for Kayla. Stop the bias. Each chant felt like a personal indictment. Carter began to question everything. Had he been wrong all along? Had his instincts, his training, been tainted by biases he refused to acknowledge? The questions gnawed at him, eroding the confidence he had once taken for granted. One evening, unable to bear the weight any longer, Carter found himself driving aimlessly through the city. He ended up in the same neighborhood where the incident had occurred. The alley was empty now, the shadows long and foreboding. He parked the car and stepped out, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he stood there, staring at the spot where Kayla had fallen, memories flooded back. Her terrified eyes, her desperate pleas, the way her body had convulsed on the ground. It was all too vivid. He clenched his fists, anger and shame boiling inside him. For the first time, Stephen Carter allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions. The doubts he had buried for so long rose to the surface, demanding to be confronted. And in that moment, he realized that the path forward would not be easy. It would require him to face not only the judgment of others, but also the truth about himself. The chapter closes with Carter standing alone in the alley, the echoes of his past mistakes reverberating around him as the city moves on without him. The nights were becoming unbearable. Stephen Carter would lie awake, staring at the cracks in his bedroom ceiling, his mind consumed by the events of the last few weeks. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it brought restless dreams of Kayla Harper's face and the heavy accusations from the media, his colleagues, and his own conscience. The city outside seemed to hum with tension, a constant reminder of the fallout he couldn't escape. The alley where Kayla had collapsed had become a recurring destination for his aimless drives. He would park a block away and sit in his car, staring at the empty space where his judgment had faltered. It wasn't rational, but something about being there kept him tethered to reality, as if facing that moment repeatedly could somehow make it right. His nights at the alley were solitary until one evening when he wasn't alone. As he sat in his car, headlights flashed in his rearview mirror, and a sleek black sedan pulled up behind him. Carter tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt, though he wasn't carrying his service weapon during his suspension. The car door opened, and out stepped Governor James Harper. Carter froze. This was the last person he wanted to see, especially here. Harper's silhouette was imposing against the dim streetlights, his posture rigid as he approached. He stopped a few feet from Carter's window, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" Harper's voice was calm but carried an edge that left no room for argument. Carter hesitated, then nodded, gesturing to the passenger seat. Harper opened the door and slid in, the scent of his expensive cologne briefly masking the stale air inside the car. For a moment, neither man spoke. Harper's eyes scanned the alley, the same spot Carter had been fixated on. Finally, Harper broke the silence. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. Carter exhaled slowly. "Lately, yeah." Harper nodded, as if he'd expected the answer. "Do you know why I'm here?" "I can guess," Carter replied, his voice tight. "But if you're looking for an apology, I'm not sure what to say that would make a difference." Harper turned to face him, his gaze piercing. "I'm not here for an apology, Officer Carter. I'm here because I want to understand." "Understand what?" "Why you did it," Harper said, his tone softening slightly. "Why you looked at a scared, sick child and assumed the worst." Carter looked away, his jaw tightening. The question was one he'd been asking himself, but hearing it from Kayla's father made it feel unbearable. I don't know," Carter admitted, his voice barely audible. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was protecting the community." "Protecting the community?" Harper repeated, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "By confiscating insulin from a diabetic child?" Carter flinched at the words, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him anew. He opened his mouth to respond, but Harper cut him off. "You don't have to explain," Harper said, his tone turning colder, "because I already know. You saw her skin, her neighborhood, and you made a choice. It wasn't about her actions. It was about your assumptions." The words were like a slap, but Carter didn't argue. He knew Harper was right. The truth had been gnawing at him since that day, and now it was laid bare between them. "I want to fix this," Carter said finally, his voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I can't live with what I've done." Harper studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he spoke. "Then start by listening," he said, "not to me, but to the people you've ignored for so long, the ones you think you're protecting. Because if you don't understand them, you'll keep making the same mistakes." The governor's words lingered with Carter as he began to reevaluate his life. His suspension meant he had time to reflect, to question, and, as Harper suggested, to listen. But where to begin? The idea of confronting the community he'd spent years patrolling felt daunting, almost impossible. He had always seen himself as a guardian, but now he realized how little he truly understood the people he was supposed to serve. One evening, Carter drove to a community center in the heart of the neighborhood. It was a place he'd passed countless times on patrol but had never set foot in. The building was modest, its walls adorned with murals celebrating the area's history and culture. Inside, the air buzzed with activity, children playing, adults chatting, and volunteers organizing supplies. Carter hesitated at the entrance, unsure of his welcome. He didn't need a uniform to be recognized, and the memory of Kayla's hospitalization was still fresh in everyone's minds. But before he could turn away, a voice called out, "Officer Carter, isn't it?" He turned to see a woman in her early 40s, her sharp eyes appraising him. She was petite but carried herself with an authority that made her presence commanding. "I'm Anita Johnson," she said, extending a hand. "I run this place. What brings you here?" Carter hesitated, then shook her hand. "I wanted to learn about the community, about the people here. I know I've made mistakes, and I want to do better." Anita raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "That's a nice sentiment, but words don't mean much without action. Are you willing to put in the work?" "I am," Carter said, meeting her gaze. Anita studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Officer Carter. Let's see if you're serious." The weeks that followed were humbling for Carter. Anita introduced him to residents who shared their stories of being profiled, harassed, and dismissed by the very system meant to protect them. Each conversation chipped away at the defenses he'd built over the years, forcing him to confront the biases he hadn't even realized he held. He also began volunteering at the center, helping with food drives and tutoring sessions. The work was exhausting, but rewarding, and slowly he started to see the community not as a collection of problems to be solved, but as a vibrant, complex network of individuals. One day, as he was helping a group of teenagers with their homework, Carter spotted Kayla's father walking into the center. Harper's presence was unexpected but welcome. The governor approached Carter, a faint smile on his face. "Looks like you've been busy," Harper said, glancing around the bustling room. "I'm trying," Carter replied. "It's not enough, but it's a start." Harper nodded. "It's a good start, but remember, this isn't about redemption. It's about responsibility." Carter took those words to heart. His journey wasn't about clearing his name or earning forgiveness. It was about doing the work to make amends, not just for Kayla, but for everyone he had failed. As the chapter closed, Carter stood outside the community center, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for himself, but for the possibility of change. It was a long road ahead, but he was finally taking the first steps. Stephen Carter's days at the community center began to reshape his perspective in ways he hadn't thought possible. The work was relentless, organizing donations, teaching after-school programs, and listening to the stories of people who lived in the neighborhood he once patrolled. But it was also restorative. Every interaction, every moment spent building connections, chipped away at the walls he had constructed around himself for years. Yet, the shadow of his past mistakes lingered, a constant reminder that his efforts, however genuine, would never erase what he had done to Kayla Harper. Redemption wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't even the goal anymore. It was about accountability, about acknowledging the harm he had caused and working to ensure it didn't happen again. One evening, as Carter was wrapping up a tutoring session with a group of teenagers, Anita Johnson approached him. Her expression was uncharacteristically serious, and Carter immediately sensed that something was amiss. "Stephen," she said, motioning for him to follow her into her office. Once inside, she closed the door and gestured for him to sit. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Anita sighed, leaning against her desk. "Governor Harper is holding a town hall meeting tomorrow. It's part of his initiative to address racial bias in law enforcement and to give the community a platform to speak directly to the people in power." Carter nodded slowly, unsure of where this was leading. "And he's invited you to attend," Anita continued, her gaze steady. "He wants you to share your story." Carter stiffened. Why would he want that? I'm the last person these people want to hear from. "That's exactly why," Anita said. "This isn't about you. It's about showing the community that change is possible, even from someone like you." Her words stung, but Carter couldn't argue with them. He had spent weeks trying to rebuild trust in small, incremental ways. Now he was being asked to confront the very people who had every reason to hate him. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Anita crouched in front of him, her tone softening. "Stephen, you've been showing up here every day, doing the work. You've earned the right to speak, but more importantly, you have a responsibility too. This isn't just about what you've done. It's about what you're willing to do to make things right." Carter sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it." The town hall was held in the gymnasium of the community center, its usual hum of activity replaced by a tense anticipation. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage where a podium stood, flanked by the flags of the state and the city. The room filled quickly, with residents of all ages gathering to share their stories and hear what their leaders had to say. Carter arrived early, dressed in plain clothes that felt simultaneously too casual and too formal for the occasion. He hovered near the back of the room, unsure of where to position himself. The stares he received were unrelenting, some curious, others hostile. Governor Harper entered shortly after, his presence commanding immediate attention. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. When his eyes landed on Carter, he gave a small nod before making his way over. "Glad you could make it," Harper said, his tone neutral. "I'm not sure anyone else is," Carter replied, glancing nervously at the crowd. Harper's expression softened. "They will be, once they hear you out. Just speak from the heart." Before Carter could respond, the meeting was called to order. Harper took the stage, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began. "This is an opportunity for us to have an honest, open dialogue about the issues that have plagued our city for far too long. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, and tonight we acknowledge it together." Applause rippled through the room, though it was tempered by the gravity of his words. Harper went on to outline the steps his administration was taking to address systemic bias, from increased training for officers to community oversight committees. Then he paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. "But tonight isn't just about policies," he continued. "It's about people. It's about stories. And to start, I'd like to invite someone to share theirs. Officer Stephen Carter, would you join me?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Carter, and he felt his chest tighten. For a moment, he considered walking out, leaving this moment to fade into someone else's memory. But then he saw Kayla sitting in the front row, her small frame dwarfed by the chair but her gaze unwavering. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Carter stood and made his way to the stage. The walk felt interminable, the weight of the crowd's scrutiny pressing down on him with each step. When he reached the podium, he gripped its edges tightly, his knuckles white against the wood. "I'm not sure where to start," he began, his voice shaking. "I'm not even sure I belong here, but I know I owe you all an apology. Especially you, Kayla." He looked directly at her, and for a moment, her expression softened. What happened that day in the alley wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure to see you as a person, to listen to you, to protect you. I let my biases dictate my actions, and because of that, I hurt you. I hurt this community." The room remained silent, the tension palpable. Carter took a deep breath, his voice steadying. "For years, I told myself I was doing my job, following protocol. But the truth is, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was enforcing a system that treats people differently based on the color of their skin, on where they live, on what they look like. And for that, I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the last word and he paused, letting the weight of his confession sink in. He glanced at Harper, who gave him an encouraging nod, then continued. "I know words aren't enough. That's why I've been spending the past few weeks here at the community center trying to understand what I didn't before. Listening to your stories, seeing your struggles, it's opened my eyes in ways I can't fully explain. And while I can't change the past, I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to make things right." When he finished, the silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, slowly, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was Kayla. The sound was tentative at first, but it grew stronger, and soon others joined in. The applause wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. Carter stepped down from the stage, his heart pounding. As he made his way back to his seat, Kayla approached him. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "You really mean it?" she asked softly. "I do," Carter said, his voice firm, "and I'll prove it." Kayla studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." The town hall marked a turning point, not just for Carter, but for the entire community. It wasn't a resolution. There was still anger, still distrust, but it was a step forward. For the first time, Carter felt like he was moving towards something, rather than running from his past. As he left the gymnasium that night, he looked up at the stars, their light faint but persistent against the darkness. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The gymnasium had emptied, but the echoes of the town hall lingered in Stephen Carter's mind. The tentative applause, the piercing questions from the crowd, and Kayla Harper's cautious acceptance of his apology replayed in his thoughts as he drove home that night. The weight of their scrutiny still clung to him, but for the first time in weeks there was something else, a glimmer of resolve. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table staring at a blank notebook. It was Anita's idea. "Write down everything you've learned, everything you felt," she had told him, "not for anyone else, but for you. You need to understand your own story before you can move forward." He had resisted at first, thinking it unnecessary, but after last night he realized how much he needed to make sense of it all. Carter picked up his pen and began to write, the words spilling onto the page in uneven bursts. He wrote about his childhood, growing up with a father who equated discipline with fear, whose rigid views on race and authority shaped Carter's worldview in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. He wrote about joining the force, the pride he once felt in wearing the badge, and how that pride had soured into cynicism over the years. But most of all, he wrote about Kayla, her fear, her vulnerability, and her strength. The way she had looked at him during the town hall, not with hatred, as he had expected, but with a guarded hope that was somehow more painful. She had given him a chance to prove himself, and he was determined not to waste it. At the community center, the mood was different after the town hall. There was still tension, still anger, but also a sense of cautious optimism. Residents who had once avoided Carter now acknowledged him with nods or brief greetings. Anita noticed the change too, and she pulled him aside one afternoon. "You're making progress," she said, her tone approving. "But don't get comfortable. One good meeting doesn't erase everything." "I know," Carter replied. "This isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it." Anita smiled faintly. "Good, because there's still a lot of work to do." That work came in many forms. Carter continued volunteering at the center, helping with food drives and tutoring programs, but he also began attending community forums and workshops on systemic bias and police reform. These sessions were eye-opening, filled with stories that mirrored Kayla's, but were far more extensive in their reach. Each story was a reminder of the long road ahead, both for himself and for the system he had served for so long. Meanwhile, the independent review of the police department was in full swing. Investigators combed through case files, interviewed officers and community members, and examined patterns of behavior within the force. Carter was called in to testify, and the experience was as harrowing as he had anticipated. The hearing was held in a sterile conference room at City Hall, its walls lined with portraits of past mayors and governors. Carter sat at the long table, flanked by his attorney on one side and a stenographer on the other. Across from him sat the review board, a mix of legal experts, activists, and law enforcement officials. Governor Harper was among them, his expression unreadable as he observed the proceedings. "Officer Carter," one of the board members began, "thank you for being here today. We understand this is a difficult time for you, but we hope you'll cooperate fully with this review." "I intend to," Carter said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. The questions came swiftly, probing his actions in the alley that day and his broader approach to policing. Carter answered honestly, though each response felt like another layer of his defenses being stripped away. "Do you believe your actions toward Kayla Harper were influenced by racial bias?" one board member asked pointedly. Carter hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, they were. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, there's no other explanation. I saw her as a threat because of my own assumptions, not because of anything she did." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of his admission hanging in the air. Carter glanced at Harper, who met his gaze with a slight nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't condemnation either. The hearing continued for hours, delving into his record and the broader culture of the department. By the end of it, Carter felt drained but strangely lighter, as if unburdening himself of the truth had given him a small measure of peace. In the weeks that followed, the results of the review began to take shape. Several officers were suspended or reassigned, and new policies were implemented to address systemic issues within the department. These changes were met with mixed reactions, celebration from activists and skepticism from within the force. Carter, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. His suspension was extended indefinitely, and while no formal charges were filed against him, it was clear that his career in law enforcement was over. The realization was bittersweet. He had spent so much of his life defining himself by the badge, and now he was forced to confront who he was without it. One afternoon, as he packed up his belongings from his precinct locker, Joe approached him. The younger officer looked uncomfortable, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hey," Joe said awkwardly. "I heard about the review. Tough break." Carter shrugged. "It's fair, I earned it." Joe hesitated, then nodded. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing at the center is good. Important." "Thanks," Carter said, though the words felt hollow. He didn't need Joe's approval. He needed to keep moving forward. The final piece of Carter's journey came in the form of an unexpected invitation. Kayla Harper's school was hosting a community event, and she had asked him to attend. The request was both humbling and terrifying, but Carter knew he couldn't refuse. The event was held in the school auditorium, its walls decorated with artwork and posters from the students. Kayla was among the speakers, and when she took the stage, the room fell silent. She spoke about her experiences, about the fear and anger she had felt that day in the alley and the weeks that followed. But she also spoke about hope, about the possibility of change, even in the most unlikely places. "Officer Carter hurt me," she said plainly, her voice steady, "but he's also shown me that people can change, and that gives me hope, for him, for my community, and for our future." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Carter felt tears sting his eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. This wasn't about him. It was about her, about the strength she had shown in the face of everything he had put her through. After the event, Kayla approached him, her small hand extended. He shook it, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply. She smiled. "You're welcome. Just don't mess it up." Carter laughed, the sound surprising even himself. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of closure, not an end, but a beginning. As Carter walked out of the school that evening, the city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling against the dark sky. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time he felt ready to face it. His journey wasn't over. It had barely begun, but he was determined to see it through. Not for redemption, but for justice. For Kayla. For everyone. If this story hooked you, subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Share this story with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. And to see even more stories, skip to the next video or explore others on our channel.